Good morning, everybody. Hi, happy NAIDOC week. I'm Professor Leah Bromfield. I'm the director of the Australian Centre for Child Protection, and really delighted to be introducing Jacynta today. I do want to acknowledge the Kaurna people, who are the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet in person today. I also want to extend my respects to the traditional owners of the lands of the many people who are on the Zoom today. We had more than 370 registrations for today's event, which shows the interest and importance in this work. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I want to recognise that in the field of child protection, we have to hold at the heart of our work that memory of what has happened through colonisation, racism and stolen generations to Aboriginal children, families and communities. We have to learn from the past, and I think we should be and are very fortunate to be able to learn from the ways of knowing and doing of Aboriginal people who, prior to colonisation, had their Aboriginal children were safe, healthy and thriving in culture. And that's what we had to learn from Aboriginal people, how to raise children who are strong, thriving, healthy. And we have a deep responsibility to support and listen to how we get back to that. And so this NAIDOC week, I'm really delighted to be hearing from Dr. Jacynta Krakouer, who's going to be speaking on the topic towards systemic transformation, shifting thinking on First Nations self-determination in child protection. So just such a critically important topic. I'm really proud to call Jacynta a colleague. Jacynta is a Minang Noongar woman from southern Western Australia. She lives and works on Wurundjeri land. She is the inaugural Aboriginal Enterprise Fellow at the University of South Australia, and we are deeply fortunate to have her having joined UniSA. She's also a member of the Australian Centre for Child Protection. Jacynta's PhD in social work at the University of Melbourne focused on cultural connections for First Nations children and young people in out-of-home care. She's a fabulous researcher. I've had the benefit to partner with Jacynta on some projects, and she is a deep thinker, a brilliant researcher. She's also a social worker by background, so she knows this field, she knows our families, and is currently a respite carer for residential care. Jacynta, please, welcome. Thank you. I'll just say we will have some time at the end for some questions, and if you're on the Zoom, please feel free to post them up in the chat. We'll be able to hear questions from the Zoom as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Leah. I'm really excited to be speaking with you all today about this really important topic, an area that I'm really passionate about. So I wanted to begin by situating myself in relation to country. Here's a picture of Emu Point in Albany, which is where my mob is from. I'm a Minang Noongar woman, so from right down the southern tip of Western Australia, living and working primarily in Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, but also work here in Tanzania and Ghana country from time to time. I think it's really important to situate and ground ourselves in relation to the many countries that we come from and thinking about the diversity of First Nations people throughout Australia. And that's why I love the map in the top left-hand corner that shows how many different sovereign nations we have as part of the continent now known as Australia. So I am a social worker by background, and I spent my time primarily working in the out-of-home care field as a social work practitioner, working with children and young people in foster care before moving into residential care as well. I also worked in early intervention and family support for a time, and I spent most of my practice time at the Victoria Childcare Agency. So I know the Victorian out-of-home care context better than I do across other jurisdictions. So today I wanted to talk about self-determination and how it's operationalised in child protection and out-of-home care. I'm going to begin with a discussion about the idea of self-determination and what that means in Western moral philosophical thought, before moving into an understanding of Indigenous self-determination, and what that means according to the rights of Indigenous people under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Then move into a discussion about how self-determination is understood and practiced in Australia before turning to child protection, and drawing on an example from the Victorian context where arguably we have the strongest commitment to self-determination being practiced in a more truer form at present. And I'm going to talk about recent changes in legislation in Victoria, which have changed the way in which we practice delegated authority, before then looking at lessons that we can learn from international experiences of self-determination in countries with similar settler colonial histories to Australia, so Canada, the United States, and Aotearoa New Zealand. And then have a think at the end about what Indigenous people aspire for the future in terms of child and family welfare practice and systems. Importantly, I think it's necessary for me to say that I'm in a journey, I suppose, of being early in my thinking around this. So this lecture is really around exploring this concept and using it as an opportunity to come together and to think about what future possibilities could emerge through the practice of self-determination and what self-determination means for distinct Indigenous peoples. So beginning with the idea of self-determination, the idea of self-determination can be traced back to the 16th century with Western moral philosophy and thinkers such as John Locke, followed then up in the next century by Immanuel Kant. Now, they theorized self-determination as an individual capacity for free will. So the individual is self-determining insofar as they have their own free will and ability to undertake whatever actions they desire, that people in themselves are autonomous. This idea of self-determination applied strictly to individuals, and it was later iterations of self-determination thought that transposed this idea of individual free will to a people or a nation. So we have that understanding of individuals being able to will themselves to an identity of a nation or a people, and that process, I suppose, of authorization of the individual then gets applied to the collective. I think that's a really important thing to hold in mind when we're thinking about Indigenous peoples and the ways in which their identity as a First Nations person from a distinct mob or a distinct country then applies to their First Nations people from that region. So that individual understanding of self-determination was really thought of as a capacity, whereas later ideas of self-determination brought to the fore this thinking around self-determination as a right. And that's the way in which it's understood in international legal thought. The right for some whole nations or peoples to be free from external domination and subjugation, where you have the external right of secession, which really came about throughout the decolonisation movement, and it was around the idea of the sovereignty of individual nations and what legitimate forms of sovereignty can be practiced. So with the international community putting pressure on colonial or on the colonizer to extract themselves from territories which they had claimed illegitimately. We had this thinking around self-determination needing to be practiced as a process of decolonisation. This sat alongside thoughts around internal self-determination as the freedom to pursue your own collective interests, to form your own forms of self-governance as determined by the people, and to practice self-determination in ways that would benefit your political, economic, social aspirations for your people while being free from external interference. That's a little background to the idea of self-determination. But as it's applied to Indigenous people, it has a bit of a different connotation in that the right of Indigenous people falls somewhat in between this idea of external self-determination and the right to secession and the idea of internal self-determination. So Indigenous people under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of, under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, to which Australia is a signatory in 2008, have the right of self-determination, the right to freely determine your political status, to determine your economic, social interests. So that sits with that idea of internal self-determination. But it is also very explicit in the right to autonomy and self-governance, which sits closely to this idea of external self-determination. But secession is something that is practiced in exceptional circumstances and so isn't typically applied to Indigenous people. It does highlight, though, with this idea of autonomous practice that we have the right to form our own structures, our own governance mechanisms, and to do these in ways that we determine are best for our peoples. As I put down in the bottom, there is that caveat in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that nothing in the declaration can undermine the existing political integrity of states. So that right to cessation is not there. This essentially means that Indigenous sovereignty in Australia and the sovereignty of the state actually coexist. They sit side by side and both are possible. Underpinning this idea of Indigenous self-determination, the words which I put at the bottom of the screen, Torres Strait Islander political theorist Sana Nakada talks about that autonomy, that freedom, sovereignty and control as these underpinning principles of Indigenous self-determination in Australia. And she highlights that Indigenous self-determination in Australia could not be practiced as a process of decolonisation, where the coloniser exits the sovereign territory of the Indigenous people, but rather that with settlers remaining here in Australia and the two forms of sovereignty coexisting, that the focus instead on Indigenous self-determination has been about the transformation of settler relations and Indigenous relations. And it's been primarily concerned with ideas about what forms of governance can be legitimately enacted over Indigenous people by the settler state, and how can we increase Indigenous decision-making and control in policy design, in service delivery, and in programs. So that idea of Indigenous governance and autonomy sitting within the confines of the existing settler state, but also needing to enable enough Indigenous control. In the 1970s, we began to see Indigenous self-determination in Australia practiced. And I put this picture up of the Wave Hill, as a result of the Wave Hill activism, Vincent Lingiari and Bob Hawke returning the land to the Gurindji people. And I think that's a really telling picture in that when self-determination first started to be operationalised under the Labor Hawke government, it really was concerned with autonomy and land rights and having control of land in order to pursue economic self-determination, in addition to other forms of self-determination, such as political and social within the confines of having your own kind of autonomous area that you control and the people sitting within that area. As we move throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, we begin to see the formation of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, which in some ways act as a form of governance and a form of Indigenous people being able to have those mechanisms where they can negotiate relations with states, where they can negotiate policy design and program and service delivery. And importantly, in the 70s and the 80s and into the early years of the 90s, we had the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was distinctly associated with political representation, and a body which was decided by community and chosen in a way that suited the various different First Nations communities and enabled that negotiation at that high political level, separate from service delivery. As we move throughout the years, we move into more of a neoliberal policy era. We then move into self-management and mainstreaming. Self-determination tends to be watered down a little bit in these years before we then start to think about self-determination again, with things such as the Closing the Gap campaign. And more recently, we're seeing the Voice to Parliament debates and the referendum. But we see Indigenous self-determination practiced as sometimes consultation, sometimes stronger input, and sometimes control over government decision-making explicitly in policy. And I include an example of the Safe and Supportive National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, where SNAIC was involved quite heavily in the design of that particular policy. So in the child protection context, from the 1980s, we began to see our first Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, specifically for child and family welfare, put into practice. And that began with the then Aboriginal community-controlled organisation before it became VACA, it was ACCA. And we saw the establishment of SNAIC as the body for First Nations peoples related to children and young people. It was really focused on service delivery in the early years and trying to increase control of services that were by and designed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people, drawing on international lessons from Canada where we and the United States, where we took some of their understanding about how to ensure placement was suitable and how to ensure Indigenous people could care for their own children. And so we began to see the beginnings of the Aboriginal child placement principle before it was later converted into a broader understanding, not just focusing on placement, but focusing on other elements. And more recent, and back then as well as it still remains today, the focus was on preventing removals. So having the care of children in a statutory context as a last resort, and Indigenous people needing to have their children return home, have their children immersed in culture so we could prevent and undo the effects of the stolen generations and make sure that we aren't creating a new stolen generations. Of course, in recent times, there has been commentary about the fact that we are still doing that. But recent developments around delegated authority are important, and they exist to ensure that we are actually operating our child protection and out-of-home care systems in ways that are legitimate for Indigenous people, and that the removals themselves are done in ways that are legitimate and the placements are done in ways that uphold the full Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement. So moving into Victoria, I wanted to put this slide up to show how there are a range of reforms and initiatives and policies that underpin the commitment to self-determination in Victoria. And it is an explicit position by the Victorian government that Aboriginal self-determination is actually embedded in legislation, specifically the Children, Youth and Families Act. And there's been a range of different policies and initiatives that the Victorian government has undertaken in the pursuit of Aboriginal self-determination. So the Task Force 1000 report was a systemic inquiry into all Aboriginal children in Victorian out-of-home care systems and child protection at the time. And it highlighted areas where practice was deficient, particularly in mainstream child and family welfare services. It highlighted areas of improved practice for Aboriginal community controlled organisations. And it also brought to the fore a range of issues that actually underpin children's reasons for entering child protection in the first place. So it noted things such as the high representation of children who had experienced family violence and parental substance use or parental mental health issues, and then intersecting with child protection systems, among many other issues. From there, we started to see the Wangaruru Gap Gap Dua, Children and Families Agreement and Action Plan, which set forth a course and position for reform in the Victorian child protection and out-of-home care system, the roadmap for reform, as well as an explicit sort of statement of policy reform and areas in other departments as well. So the Koran Ballot Aboriginal Health and Wellbeing Safety, which sits in the Department of Health. The Aboriginal Children's Forum is also a key area where we have governance arrangements between Aboriginal people and the state to come together and negotiate things such as policy design and program delivery. Against this backdrop in Victoria, we also have the Yoorrook Justice Commission, which is the first royal commission looking into systemic injustice against Indigenous peoples historically and into the present, specifically in the child protection arena, which has found that systemic racism is a problem, probably not surprisingly. It has also called into question the legitimacy of the existing child protection system in Victoria and its practice with Indigenous people, given that things such as cultural plans are not always done, and that we have high proportions of cultural plans that are sitting there despite legislation saying that every child, Aboriginal child in out-of-home care must have one. We then have the treaty arrangement as well, which has its own governance mechanisms and its own accountability mechanisms, which complicates the picture of policy reform in Victoria. In addition to that, negotiating policy is always different, or always difficult, with different ACOs, different Aboriginal people at the table in those governance arrangements, with those policies not necessarily communicating with one another or sitting side by side in their design and delivery. And furthermore, different ACOs and different First Nations communities, for that fact, have different aspirations, different capacities, and different desires for how they want to enact Aboriginal self-determination. So this complicates the picture of self-determination and shows that really a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. The Aboriginal Children's Forum I put up as an example of the difficulties we have with representation in Aboriginal governance. So this is a forum that enables Aboriginal community controlled organisations and the state to come together to talk about policy design and program delivery, to talk about any issues that emerge, such as the Yoorrook Justice Commission, and to come have a negotiation arrangement explicitly at the table. The membership is restricted to Aboriginal community controlled organisations, however, fitting the criteria as indicated on the screen. So things such as membership must be a 50% majority, the primary focus on service delivery for vulnerable children and families. The secretariat function also rests with the state, and I think while that can appear to have a role of taking that onus off of Aboriginal community controlled organisations to do that administrative function, the Secretariat also has the important task of developing agendas and taking minutes. So that control function in some ways still rests with the state. And when we think about representation as belonging to Aboriginal community controlled organisations, we then also have to think about who is excluded from those conversations. And that includes children and young people who have been a part of the system sometimes. It also can exclude the parents and the families who have experienced the full coercive control of the state. We then need to think about, in Victoria and Melbourne in particular, as a place of migration and movement where lots of First Nations people from diverse First Nations communities throughout Australia come to live and reside, such as myself. So originally from Southern Western Australia, but moved to Melbourne back in the 1980s when my dad played AFL and then decided to make Melbourne his home. So we also have that complexity in that it is not just people from Victoria living in Victoria. So our experience with Section 18 and delegated authority, it began with specific delegated authority within the out-of-home care field. So specifically, the Secretary of the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, under the Children, Youth and Families Act, can delegate specified powers and functions to the principal officer, namely the CEO of an Aboriginal agency, as defined in certain ways under the Act, so typically Aboriginal community controlled organisations, in relation to an Aboriginal child or the sibling, a non-Aboriginal sibling of an Aboriginal child. That person, the CEO of the Aboriginal community controlled organisation, can then delegate certain powers that they have been delegated down to people in their organisation. Initially, it was around the guardianship function in out-of-home care and the CEO of an Aboriginal community controlled organisation being able to be the primary guardian as opposed to the secretary. 2 weeks ago, we actually had an amendment of the Act, which in some ways was prompted, I think, by the Europe Justice Commission and the focus that commission put on the child protection system itself. The fact that it did publicly call into question the legitimacy of that system and did highlight the systemic racism underpinning the system and the failures to uphold certain areas within the legislation, such as cultural plans. The bill was attempted to be passed in Parliament last year, but wasn't successful the first time round, and then was pushed through early this year, interestingly around the same time that the state was called to the stand as part of the Europe Justice Commission. And so the powers that now can be delegated under Section 18 include the power of a protective intervener, so the power to actually do child protection interventions and to receive child protection reports, as well as the powers that exist in relation to a protection order or a relevant order. So it talks about temporary assessment orders, permanent care orders as those forms of other orders. So essentially Aboriginal community controlled organisations, so long as they choose to sign up to receive these powers, can do things such as case planning, cultural planning. They can accept full parental responsibility and all the powers under the Act that comes with the parental responsibility element around placement, decision-making, decisions such as who the child resides with, even what medical care is received, therapeutic treatment planning. But I think importantly, the focus on the protective intervention and Aboriginal community controlled organisations now receiving those reports, receiving access to the child protection information system, not the one that's delegated for service providers, but the one that actually has historically sat with the state, being able to then investigate those reports and decide which children should be removed and under what circumstances, specifically for Aboriginal children or non-Indigenous children who are the sibling of an Aboriginal. I put this up, the intersection of the placement principle with identity, and really to speak to the complexity of Indigenous identity. So even within the Act, the Children, Youth and Families Act, we have a recognition that children come from different backgrounds, different First Nations backgrounds, that they may have two parents from different First Nations communities, that they may have one Aboriginal parent and one non-Indigenous parent, and really that the self-identification of the child is the principal factor, that the child can choose and that the expressed desires of the child are particularly important. In this way, the complexity of Indigenous identity is not well understood. In my PhD, I really talked about cultural connection being understood as a journey of culturally connecting, in which the child develops their identity and their connection over time, which can change. It doesn't also necessarily take into account the desires of different First Nations family members well, when you're sitting in a context where cultural disconnection actually exists within the child protection and out-of-home care system, and in some ways has been produced through that legacy of intergenerational removals and trauma. So we need to also think about the powers resting with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to intervene into different First Nations families with their own distinct histories, and who has authorised those Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to decide on behalf of people from different nations, and how we reconcile, I guess, the tensions of Indigenous identity within this governance arrangement that in some ways is not fully autonomous and is not something that's fully controlled by First Nations people. I think this is a particularly important point, that the powers that can be delegated under the Section 18 area of the Children, Youth and Families Act can be revoked by the Secretary of the Department of Families, Fairness and Justice. So that ultimate power does still rest with the state. And it does result in that less than fully independent governance and perhaps a veneer of self-determination, given that self-determination is fundamentally about freedom from external state interference, freedom to pursue your interests, full autonomy and control, and self-governance. How that can exist when the power ultimately rests with the state to determine who gets the power to intervene, to not intervene, to have the guardianship, to not have the guardianship. That is another tension that comes into the fore. I put this slide up around the building blocks of the Snake Family Matters campaign, the idea of governments and services being accountable to Aboriginal people, Aboriginal families having full access to the entire suite and gamut of things that are necessary to ensure healing, to ensure that families can be well and healthy and functioning and able to look after their children, which requires investment in prevention and early intervention services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations to have control over their children and to decide on their aspirations and decide how they want those aspirations to be enacted, to make sure law and policy and practice is culturally safe and responsive. And that sits alongside the 5 core elements of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. The need to have prevention, partnership, full participation, the placement and the connection elements. So some of the challenges that I see with for Indigenous agencies with child protection practice in Victoria relates to the exercise of authority within a coercive statutory system. So fundamentally, the system has not changed. The transfer of this Western colonial system to Indigenous people is what is occurring, without the law necessarily changing in ways that Indigenous people have determined are important for them. There is a statement of recognition within the new Children, Youth and Families Act, which means that the harms of colonisation and the harms of child removal do need to be taken into account when making decisions for children and families that come to the attention of child protection systems. But there are those existing tensions that remain with legal principles such as the best interests of the child, which historically, and I would argue into the contemporary, still is understood in ways that privilege Eurocentric understandings of what a child's best interests are, and in some ways divorce a child's best interests from their community and from their culture. They tend to see those things as distinct rather than children as being embedded in a network of complex relationality where their identity and their interests are tied to country, community and family. We then have the tensions which exist around the rights of the child versus the rights of the parent, and then by extension, the rights of the community. And the difficulty that comes with an Aboriginal community controlled organisation exerting that power over the people that they have been authorised to govern for. That then calls into question issues of identity and representation and how we can legitimately, again, enact this form of governance over Indigenous people and this form of control. We then have issues of non-Indigenous control remaining within the system. So control over reports, we have mandated reporters that, of course, are not all going to be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They can come from anywhere in the community, and the mandated reporters specifically from particular professions. The process itself is still the notify, investigate system. That is a Western system imposed again on First Nations people, not necessarily a system that Indigenous people have designed for their children's safety and well-being. The court outcomes still remain, so there is no power and control over the existing Western legal system for First Nations people. We still have the non-Indigenous magistrates and lawyers, non-Indigenous workers within Aboriginal community controlled organisations as well. The power to investigate does not necessarily sit in identified positions either. So that's not stated within the legislation. That's another complexity that comes to the fore. And in addition to that, another challenge, of course, is the need for prevention and early intervention. So the need for family healing, the need for significant investment to enable families to have their needs met, particularly when they're living with things such as poverty and intergenerational trauma, housing issues or acute mental health issues that require a response that sits outside of the child protection system. Individual choice relating to service delivery is another complexity. So when we legislate that Aboriginal children will be case managed by an Aboriginal community controlled organisation or investigated by an Aboriginal community controlled organisation, we do have the effect of actually taking away some of that autonomy and choice from the individual, which is important when we think about the idea of self-determination and its beginnings in understandings in the idea of the individual and their capacity for free will, and that individual as legitimating and being a part of a collective. Some of the challenges I see as to the realisation of Indigenous self-determination in this child protection context relate to that tension between the individual versus collective self-determination, and how we reconcile the complexity of Indigenous identity and issues of representation. At present, I would argue that we don't have strong political forms of governance enacted for First Nations people. We obviously have current conversation and the desire for the voice to Parliament, and for that representation to occur at a political level, not realised as yet. Also, when we're thinking about the voice to Parliament, we're thinking about a singular voice as opposed to the many voices of First Nations people. The other big tension I see is this issue of legitimacy and accountability. So a core underpinning of governance is for the state or whoever who's governing to be accountable to the people for whom they govern, and for legitimacy of, I guess, the state intervening into the private realm of family life has to be there. We cannot undertake child protection functions without society in general authorising and allowing the state to intervene at that level. It's perhaps one of the most coercive forms of governance we can undertake to intervene into the private realm of family life and to withdraw a parent's rights to parent their child. So that comes into question how we can enable the legitimacy of removals for First Nations people with this different governance structure, this different mechanism for undertaking the removal itself and the investigation itself, and what accountability mechanisms exist to Indigenous peoples as not a singular homogenous group, but a diverse collective of people from different nations. And then the other big challenge is that the ultimate power still does rest with the state. It still does have that power to revoke the Section 18 delegated powers. It has the power, obviously, to provide those Section 18 authorised powers. And so it's questionable if true self-determination, as understood in its most authentic meaning of the term, can be achieved within this existing state apparatus, or whether or not we actually need to see different forms, different systems, different forms of governance come to the fore. And so some of the lessons I think that we can draw from international experiences. I'm not an expert by any means on international child protection systems, so I touch on these lightly. But in the United States, we know that they do have tribal authority and self-government under the Indian Child Welfare Act, and that this means that they have full autonomy over the court system, over the investigations, over the removals, over the placement decisions for children living in those particular tribes. They have sovereignty over their jurisdiction. The recent challenges to the Indian Child Welfare Act are telling, in that even with a system that has had its own legitimacy and has been established for multiple years, since 50 years, we're still actually seeing challenges by non-Indigenous people around the Indian Child Welfare Act and whether or not it's actually discriminatory. So I find that an interesting challenge, that even when a system has been in place for some time, those issues of legitimacy can still come up, perhaps by Indigenous people, but also by non-Indigenous people. In Canada, you have the Indian Act, and you have what is known as children who are referred to as status Indians or non-status under their act. So there's a determination around identity and who counts and who does not count, which has its own complexities. You have Aboriginal self-governance arrangements. You have on-reserve First Nations child and family welfare programs that have existed since 1991 with delegated models of provincial authority. So authority for those children living on reserve. But alongside that, we also have the challenges to those arrangements, particularly in relation to funding, which has been brought to the Human Rights Tribunal, and a contemporary class action taking place as a result of the finding that the system itself was discriminatory and did not provide adequate funding for First Nations children living on reserve. That funding for First Nations people to be able to self-govern in the way that they wanted to be able to provide those early intervention and prevention services were not there. So it left First Nations people in Canada in a position where they were the ones, they had the 60s scoop, referred to as the Millennium Scoop, but they were the ones doing the scooping. So some of those tensions come up in those circumstances. Interestingly, both the United States and Canada and Aotearoa New Zealand also have treaties established, which we don't have in Australia. So that's another area, I think, which complicates governance arrangements and being able to perhaps transpose or take from an international context something that works or may not work in that jurisdiction and place it in the Australian context. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, I draw on the recent Waitangi Tribunal Oranga Tamariki urgent inquiry, which commenced as a result of, an incident where a baby was uplifted from the hospital in Hawke's Bay and attracted significant media attention, called into question the legitimacy of Oranga Tamariki undertaking the removals in the way they did, resulted in a halt to all protective applications for a period, and focused on what reform could look like as well in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I find it interesting for some of the findings in that report around the recommendation not to transfer functions of removal from the state to Māori as yet, even though diverse opinions were put forward. So different opinions were articulated around the need to completely abolish and decolonise the system, to partner with government and actually have some of those functions. And they did acknowledge that complex factors do result in child protection intervention. So the solution is not necessarily removing those powers from the state and giving them to Indigenous people and expecting that the problem will be solved. There was discussion of the importance of keeping support and removal functions separate. And the recommendation, importantly, of establishing a Māori Transition Authority to lead the design and the delivery of a future Māori system that is designed by Māori for Māori, but not rushing into anything, taking time to actually get those different components right and ensure that it's responsive to the diverse perspectives of Māori. I really love the quote at the beginning: the piecemeal reform of oranga tamariki, no matter how well designed, will ultimately fail another generation of children, both Māori and non-Māori, if the same factors placing that inhumane stress on families continue unabated. So the responsibility we have to make sure that families can be well and functioning. I put some of the voice design principles up because I find that they're really interesting and they speak to some of this complexity. The need to have whatever governance arrangements are made following the voice process, if successful, to be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities based on the wishes of local communities. So responding to the diversity of First Nations communities throughout Australia, making sure that it's representative, and they have a range of different principles around ensuring gender balance and youth participation, for example, to make sure that it's empowering, community-led, inclusive, respectful, and culturally informed. So governance arrangements that suit Indigenous people as determined by Indigenous people. Accountability and transparency is a key design principle, and ensuring that this governance arrangement does not have a program delivery function, so is separate from the conflicts that can arise if you're a part of governance as well as program service delivery, given that funding for service delivery often sits with the state funding you for that service, and the complexities that abound then. And my last slide is really around thinking about what Indigenous aspirations are for the future and for thinking about systemic transformation of systems. Whether or not, and I think Luke Fitzgerald, who is a Māori scholar in Aotearoa, New Zealand, did his PhD thesis around decolonisation for Māori. And he asked, well, what is the starting point? Is the starting point for a system to ensure that children are safe? And if so, if we are just focused on the safety of children, then perhaps partnering between Māori and the state can work. But is the question and the starting point to undo the damage that colonisation has done and to ensure healing, to ensure that First Nations communities are well and thriving, and that children are well and thriving and happy and connected in culture? And if that is the question that we begin with, then we really need to be thinking about a different form of governance and a different system entirely. A different system where Māori, and in our case, First Nations people in Australia, can have control, but also taking into account the lessons from the Oranga Tamariki Tribunal, where we need to think about implementing this over time and not rushing for any solutions. Where Indigenous peoples can be responsible for their families and for their children, regardless of where they reside. And I find the final point, this was actually of the draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous people. So it's not wording within the current declaration, but it did include the right for Indigenous children, to not be removed from their communities and families under any pretext. So that fundamental desire for First Nations people not to have their children removed from their families and communities and displaced from culture, but actually to ensure children are safe and well and thriving within families and communities. And the question then remains, how can we do that? How can we make sure that families and communities and First Nations peoples can heal and realise their own desires for self-determination into the future, and what sort of system will that look like? So I leave you with those thoughts. Thank you. So
time for questions, sorry.
thanks, Leah. So I have time for questions if anyone has anything or any comments. And open to that for those online as well. You're welcome to type a message into the chat.
People with questions. No, I need an advisor. I'd be interested as well in comments from people. It's such a complicated space. The journey we're on around considering how you do that. Repeat.
You're such a formidable and amazing woman, and I was sitting here thinking about well, up until very recently, thinking about drafting new legislation in South Australia, and I was just thinking about sort of the iterative approach to where you want to be with a whole new construct and a whole new way of being, but then where you are, in a system, and thinking about how do you make it? It's always that tension, isn't it? How do you try to make the best legislation that you can within the constructs of the current state legislative approach to child protection versus actually how do you throw it all out and start again? So, but what I was really thinking about as you were talking was the critical importance of getting the best interest reference right, and how we really strengthen that. So I've actually taken some thoughts away about, not that I can chat to the people who'll be doing the work now, but I just wanted to say thank you. I think it's a really, it's a, I was actually thinking it's almost like a blueprint of all the things we need to think about when we're trying to reform systems. So it was really helpful.
Thank you, Jacynta. My name's Tracy, and I'm been a long time senior Aboriginal practitioner that's worked in the child protection for many years, and also advocating for Aboriginal children more broadly prior to that. I'm really interested in, I guess, sort of building on from what Fiona's saying is where you've got exercise of authority within a coercive statutory function. I guess the challenge for us as Aboriginal people, for most Aboriginal people working in the system is, the rights of the child versus the rights of parents and community and what that means. But I liked your end slide the most is how do we get there in terms of not removing Aboriginal children, but making sure that they're safe within family, safe within culture. I'm just intrigued, and I guess I want to know a bit more about what you think that would look like.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think the rights of the child versus the rights of the parent or the family, it's a tension that I think comes up within the system, but we don't necessarily need to think of it as a versus. We can actually think that sometimes they can sit alongside each other, that some parents can recognise very clearly that they may not be well enough or able enough to look after their children and provide them with the environment and that sometimes the interests that can come together. So perhaps it's also about thinking holistically. But your point around future systemic transformation, what I think it looks like, I think the one thing that I've taken away thinking about all of this content is that it's not up to an individual person to decide what that looks like, and that I can't decide for First Nations communities. Communities need to decide for themselves because they ultimately know their own communities best and what their communities aspire to, have the capacity for and desire. So I think the starting point has to be better representation and governance arrangements than what we currently have, and involving communities, and not just involving, but giving them the power to actually make those decisions in a representative way. Certainly what I do know is that the current system we have does not work. And at the moment we run the risk of taking a system that doesn't work and giving authority to First Nations people over a system that doesn't work, which is then just a transposition of problems of one system from the state to First Nations people, and perhaps in some ways a wiping of the hands of responsibility for those problems, which is, I see, not the solution.
You gave of some of our international, colleagues, that they're really good examples of that, which were responsibilities and also no funding, no resources. It was, challenged, were handed over in full.
I think just the bottom line for me is we as the proverbial state and nation and internationally have to stop looking at Aboriginal culture as a deficit. And I think if we get past that, then other great things will happen in terms of that transformation. Thank you.
Am I good to go? Or you got a question?
Yep,
You can-
absolutely.
Sorry. Hi, Jacynta. That was an amazing lecture. Thank you so much. My question, it probably relates to what Fiona and Tracy have spoken about. And I was interested to hear you name institutional racism, because I think we tend to be a little bit silent around recognising that as an issue and also as an ongoing trauma for Aboriginal people. My question is around, in your research and along your travels, have you seen anywhere that, because in the conversation of delegated authority, there seems to be lots of talk around what the ACOs are going to have to do to come up to speed to be able to work within their system. But the conversation is a little bit silent on what will all of the people, particularly non-Aboriginal people working in the child protection system and the statutory system, so public servants mostly, how are they going to transition? How are they going to adjust to a new way of thinking, a new way of doing? Because their transformation is going to have to be, I would probably argue, more significant, is probably more of a hurdle than what it will be for ACOs. So I just wondered whether, and particularly in that, with that backdrop of institutional racism, so I just wonder if in your research you've come across any examples where that's been something that's been noted and met head on with a plan of how they're going to transform their public sector.
A very good question. I haven't come across anything specifically. What I am thinking of is in Aotearoa, New Zealand, they fall back on their treaty and put that forward as what non-Indigenous people have specifically committed to and what obligations they have under the treaty. I would probably also say that that's just an inherent complexity of Indigenous self-determination, that whenever you have a process where the realisation of self-determination for Indigenous peoples requires the loss of some control by the settler, by the colonizer, by the non-Indigenous people, whatever you want to call it. It results in difficulties, and it results in people not wanting to let go of that power. I think we can see that very clearly at the moment in conversations about the voice to Parliament and the referendum. We can see the discomfort that people sit with when we, potentially lose some form of power. I think paying attention to how that conversation evolves. I'm really eagerly awaiting the release of the Europe Justice Commission's report into their child protection system inquiry, given that they have made it very clear that systemic racism is a part of the system, and the state government has acknowledged that as well. How they then talk about recommendations and how that will be addressed, I think that'll be very interesting, and I'd probably encourage you to keep your eye out for that when it's released as well.
Look online, and it's I'd say all just compliments and thank yous.
Sorry, I've just noticed one here. If you could speak more to accountability mechanisms and what they might look like. I think that's a really interesting question, and it's something that's, I suppose, an inherent principle in governance, that accountability is something that is required, that whoever govern for the people must be accountable to the people. I think what they look like is potentially we can draw on existing lessons around governance arrangements and what we currently have in place, and where we're actually potentially not doing that well in terms of state accountability. But specifically for Indigenous people, I would say that the accountability mechanisms for specific First Nations communities need to be determined by the community. My dad grew up at a time where he remembers ATSIC, and he remembers how ATSIC was established and what accountability mechanisms they had then. So he can only speak to his experience as a Minang Noongar man living in Mount Barker. But he said that representation was elected and decided by people on the ground, and he has a second cousin that was part of ATSIC. And he recalls people from those ATSIC appointments sitting down and having a cup of tea and yarning with community about issues that needed to be brought to the table, and then coming back and doing the same process, feeding the information back after having those conversations with government. So I suppose accountability fundamentally is about communication and how you enable things to be communicated very clearly to the people.
Hi, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. I'm from the Riley Foundation. So we support parents navigating the child protection system. I think there were so many things that you mentioned that makes incredible sense. The best interest of the child is probably something that comes up a lot, and some confusion about what that actually looks like. Have you seen anywhere that actually understands the need to look at that holistically and not just focus on the immediate safety of a child?
There are quite a few Indigenous writings on the topic of the best interest of the child. There's Ken Richards in Canada, writes about it from a First Nations perspective and talks about, I suppose, the importance of not seeing the child's best interests as divorced from family, community, and country, and actually acknowledging the interrelationality between all of these different concepts. Wendy Hermiston, Dr. Wendy Hermiston completed her PhD in the New South Wales child protection system, specifically around the best interests of the child. So she has some really interesting findings from her thesis around what that looks like in the New South Wales context. I think it's dependent on First Nations communities and what they see for their child, but broadly, I would say that for First Nations children, their best interests are interrelated with their belonging, their place with family, community, and the importance of culture. So some of the things that First Nations people tend to emphasize as more important are those things that were deliberately disrupted as part of colonization. So family was deliberately targeted, family life, the transmission of culture, is deliberately targeted. And these are the things that we hold on to and see as essential for the revitalisation and strengthening of our peoples. So I think understanding the complexity of our children's best interests and the holistic nature of it is something very important. I can point you to some specific references.
Have you seen any governments that have actually implemented that in legislation? Because I'm absolutely, understanding what you're saying, but have we had any governments around the world that have actually understood the need to look at that holistically and not just the immediate safety? They've been able to implement it in legislation.
I'm not an expert on this area. I can't think of anything that immediately comes to mind, but I would add that I think within the current legislation, there actually is room and there is ambiguity around the concept, which leaves it open to interpretation. And I think that's where the complexity lies, that the legislation is loose enough and wide enough, and that we have, the United Nations, which talk about all of the different rights that children have, to safety, to well-being, to living with family, to culture, to language. But it's then how it's interpreted at a practice level and how it's interpreted by magistrates and lawyers that I think is the real complexity. See that ACCOs are well supported enough to enact this role fully in terms of delegated authority and Section 18 reforms. Just my perspective, looking only at the Victorian context, because that's what I know, I would say that there is not yet enough support for prevention and early intervention, which is needed to actually reduce the overrepresentation. I would also say that perhaps we haven't given enough thought to the long-term implications of giving this responsibility to ACCOs and the result that can happen when Aboriginal people take over governance from the state. And I think in particular about the lessons from ATSIC, that these governance arrangements can always be withdrawn and that the blame for systemic failings can be transferred from the state to Indigenous people, and Indigenous people can be blamed for not correcting the problem, which I see as inherently wrong and problematic, given that we know that the system is failing.
G'day, Jacynta. Oh, that's super loud. It's Fiona Arnie. Hi.
Hi.
I'm such a fangirl of yours. I really love your work. I've been pondering on the child placement principle recently and just thinking about the extent to which it should be embedding self-determination within the principle, because the 5 elements of the principle can look really, really different to different people. So participation, connection, etc. And so I think it's a bit like you say, the best interests principle can kind of the breadth of it can mean that it can also be very narrowly interpreted. And I'm really pondering on, because we won't be able to collectively define what participation necessarily looks like, or we can probably define what prevention looks like, but all of those different elements, whether having a foundational principle of self-determination within the child placement principle would really strengthen how that gets enacted in legislation and in practice as well.
I think it's a really good point, and it's something I would be fully supportive of doing, so long as it's not just lip service. And, we want it to actually result in action. Interestingly, I think, Victoria does talk about self-determination in their Children, Youth and Families Act, so has made that explicit. And I think there's nothing to prevent other states and territories from necessarily doing the same. It doesn't need to exist within the Aboriginal child placement principle, but I think you're right on that participation point, that it doesn't necessarily go far enough, and participation is not controlled.
We might close the question, but welcome people in the room to stay and have a chat, continue the conversation. There's tea and coffee outside. But before we do that, please join me in thanking Jacynta for what was a wonderful presentation. Thanks, everyone. Set it off. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I don't think I got quite all of it. That's my.
That was a fantastic presentation. A number of things that sort of think. Communities, and so there you go. You can feel about yourself. It was really good presentation. Thank you. Anyone? Um, the question is, could the time Zoom account, not yours, because it's